Well, hi, and welcome to the premiere episode of season 8. I'm so happy to have someone I've known for, I guess, over 10 years at this point. Not that we're dating ourselves, but it's someone that I truly appreciate, someone I trust. And, recently she started going full time in private practice, and she just got a certification, I guess. I don't know the exact word, but we'll talk about it anyway. But it's an immense pleasure. I've known Michelle on so many realms. I've known Michelle through my work with her at what do we call a social service agency. I've
Mm.
known her through the church I attended. I've known her on a personal level, and now I know her in her private practice level. So, Michelle, welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Steve, for having me on. I've been, waiting for this moment, this opportunity to be able to share kind of, what this work is like for me and, and the interface of being in the office with you and knowing you from advocates. I think it's been probably 15 or so years. You were at advocates,
How
when
is
I
that
was there.
possible? I'm 27.
Well, I'm only 30, so
Oh, okay. That
um
okay.
but yeah, so it's really just an honor to be able to continue this journey and talk about what I'm doing now, where I've been, and again, you've known me for a long time, so I appreciate your interest in wanting to have me on your podcast.
Well, let's be truthful here. People don't know, but I see Michelle not super frequently, but frequently enough. And I was waiting for her to get done with the certificate. So that
Hmm.
way I can have her and have that conversation because I really want to promote not only what she's going to talk about. I don't want to spoil it. I want people to listen, but I also think that it's something that I've always found that we need to talk about as a society.
Mm.
Personally, someone once asked me, why are you so open about that? I think it's because I'm from Canada and in
Mm.
particular Quebec, because we don't use it as a taboo. But anyway, we'll get to that in a few minutes. The real first important part is to know a little more about yourself, Michelle. So I've described you a little bit, but how about you describe yourself?
Okay. Wow. I'm a lot of things. So, for the purposes of the theme of this podcast, I am a 20 years licensed mental health counselor and most recently a certified sex therapist. I am a mom, a wife, a sister, a daughter, and I have a large network of very important peers and friends that, um, make me who I am as well. So, about me, I started out, I like, when we had to do some of the intro information, I was like, I'm going to write 5 sentences for Steve. And then I was like, this is a lot. It's like a whole page. But anyway, so what I'd like to share is that I did start out way back when in high school. I actually knew by the time I was a junior in high school that I wanted to become a therapist. I wanted to become a psychologist. So I made up my mind pretty early on, and when we talk about family stuff in my background, we can talk a little bit more about probably why that happened. Um, and then I went on to get a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I was told that there were very few jobs for people like me in the world of psychology. So don't even think about it unless you have a PhD, and that was 1987.
Where did you go for your bachelor's?
UMass Amherst.
Okay.
Um, so I spent 10 years working in a field that actually taught me a tremendous amount about human behavior, but it was actually under the guise of non-human primates. And I worked at for Harvard Medical School, a regional primate research center over in Southborough for a good 10 years. And I studied animal behavior, psychological well-being in non-human primates. I actually have some articles that I was published years ago in like primates journal, and another one about psychological well-being. But anyway, I spent a lot of time learning about what makes a good primate, and we studied babies and mothers. We studied the dynamics in the social groups, and they were mostly macaques, long-tailed rhesus macaques, in captivity, born and bred in captivity. And we did a lot of study on their abnormal behaviors. And what you saw a lot of was some very self-injurious behaviors, abnormal behaviors from animals that were not reared with their mothers.
Hmm.
And they also not being raised in a social situation. A lot of times they were keeping the males and females in individual cages. And when they went to breed them, the males would beat the crap out of the females because they didn't understand the social dynamics of
Right.
from their social group. So I had a lot of experience with that. I also had a lot of experience, which was fascinating to me because I seem to have a radar for it, was a lot of the sexual behaviors in monkeys that people, maybe at the zoo you notice a couple of funny things, but there was some really interesting behaviors that I got an opportunity out in the outdoor facilities where they were kept in larger groups. I was able to witness that, and the woman that was running the psych department at UMass actually had originally, and I had done some work with her, working with monkeys. She got the job for me over at the Primate Center. She was one of Harry Harlow's students. So
Really?
yeah,
From those
she
research.
yes.
Wow.
So, with the attachment, right? Attachment came out of that as well because we were watching baby monkeys on a surrogate metal cotton wrapped mother. So I learned a tremendous amount about parenting and social structures and relationships and, distress, psychological well-being, abnormal behavior. So I did that for about 10 years. And then I went to grad school. I went to Lesley University and I got my master's degree in counseling psychology. Did a little bit of focus on counseling and spirituality. I consider myself a fairly spiritual person, as you may know somewhat of my time at the Unitarian Church that we both went to. In the meantime, I was, I had my two kids were little. My kids are like 26 and 23 now. So back then they were like 7 and 4. Actually 3. I got pregnant with my daughter while I was in grad school. So it was a really busy time. Then I went off to work at Advocates, and Advocates landed me in the throes of community mental health. We were doing a contract with DCF and doing, family work around the folks that had had their kids taken, cases opened for 51As. And the parents were, the goal was for them to get their kids either back or to get DCF out of their lives, was to kind of remedy whatever was going on that was happening. And an amazing amount of information to be learned about, again, that the intersectionality of all the things that happen that cause us to have disrupted or dysregulated childhoods, and it comes from their parents having dysregulated, disrupted childhoods. We talk about attachment, we talk about abuse, trauma, and it leads all the way into substance abuse and mental illness. So I learned a lot working at Advocates, and it was pretty intense work. And then after about 10 years, 9 or 10 years, I transitioned over to another community-based mental health clinic right down the street. It was less of a commute, less hours, but I sat at a desk all day. I still miss going out into the community. So I've done a tremendous amount of work on all ranges of mental health, mental illness. I've really learned that the focus is on well-being, wellness, healing, and over time, I realized, for me, getting to the root of these dysfunctional patterns that are, seem to be innate in primates, in humans and societies, is to really work with the core unit and working with the couple or the parents. I mean, even before they become parents, I've worked with lots of couples that had to make a decision whether or not they were actually going to spend time starting a family or even getting, married or a long-term relationship. And sometimes it's good to decide not to,
Right.
because you've got your own work to do still. And, this is not a light decision. So I've really enjoyed evolving into primarily couples therapy. And as far as the sex therapy goes, when I was probably in my late teens, early 20s, I'm probably dating myself, but Dr. Ruth was on television for the first time. And seeing someone on television talking about penises and vaginas was
Oh no, don't, please don't. No. Oh, please
it was
stop.
like, oh, that's awesome. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I grew up in a very liberal household. So it was not like a horrible thing. We were all thought it was hilarious. And I was like, oh, I want to be able to talk about that with people. So I've always, that little secret of aspiration to become Dr. Ruth. So, I'm 57 years old and I'm just beginning my next career. So this is a fantastic journey for me, and I'm learning more and more every day and living out my dreams.
Well, the first thing that came to mind is that, Dr. Ruth was on TV for the longest time. So you got plenty of time to catch up to her.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, and the other thing, Harlow's study, I'm actually going to put Harlow's study in the show notes because I think it's important. It's a very good study. If people are not familiar with it, it talks about cold mothers versus other stuff.
mhm,
And the other thing too is what I was thinking about is the bonobo monkeys,
mhm,
and sexuality with them. So I was thinking about that, and it's always something that, I hear all these things and I have all these ideas, and I got to keep myself in check around that.
mm,
And finally, the other thing I want to mention is that we have another thing in common. At 16, that's when I decided to be a therapist. So I
mm,
think we're about the same age when we decided that. So another commonality that I didn't know until today that we had.
mhm. Yeah,
The
yeah.
other thing I've never asked you though is, have you ever been in therapy? Because, that's part of what finding your way through therapy is, to just lift a little bit of that veil of what therapy truly is.
Okay. Well, this is a big question. This is the question I've been waiting for.
Yes, this is,
Yes.
should I put like tum tum afterwards?
Well, I'm hoping and I'm not, I'm kidding when I say I hope I answer it correctly, because, my answer is my answer and it's my truth and my journey. So yes, I have had some therapy. I when I was 12, my parents got divorced. I was an only child until I was 12. They had my sister and they shouldn't have had that go on, but so it was, and then they got divorced. They were both in therapy for a long time. And that's probably another reason why I wanted to go into therapy or wanted to be a psychologist, because I was fascinated with the things that they were going to. I didn't know all what they were talking about, but I knew that they were talking about their marriage and their relationship. And, my parents, part of my problem is they overshared. I got sucked into the middle of things. Emotionally, my mother was emotionally dependent on me for many years. So they were in therapy and I knew all about it. I didn't go to therapy until it was a requirement at grad school. So I am probably, and I don't know, I don't listen to all your podcasts or poll all the therapists that I know, but a lot of them are currently actively in therapy, and I am not. And sometimes I think about that. There's a little bit of like, ooh, I should be, right? I have thought over the years, is this a good time to go to therapy? Maybe I need to talk to someone. Um, my I don't want to call it reasoning, but my path has been that I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of reading. Over the years, I've done a lot of my own wellness and self care. Um, I know what I need, maybe 85% of the time. I'm not claiming to know everything, but I do know myself, and that has always been part of my work, is to know myself and to explore those things that I need. And I also have a lot of people, and I don't want to say that I've leaned on friends, but I've had a lot of, not a lot, a handful of very close people that I've been able to talk to things in life about. I could talk to my mother for many years about a lot of this stuff, and I guess what comes to mind for me now is how therapeutic that was, because it was okay for me to talk about just about anything and everything.
Right.
And the select friends that I had that I could talk like that with, there was it was like talking to a therapist. Um, yeah, I had one friend in particular that was very close. She unfortunately died of cancer a few years back. And she like let me talk. She was actually she was very supportive while I was in grad school. But anyways, I know that I there were times when I probably could have used more therapy, and I could always use some now. And sometimes I think, who would I like to do therapy with? Because I think it would be fascinating. Um, because I think I would learn a lot, but I also know that at this point I have this like this kind of bias, like, well, I'm the therapist, I should know, but I need to be able to trust somebody else. So that's the long story about my therapy experience.
Okay. Well, I think that that's, you're not the only one, frankly. There's been a few people. And I think that it's all personal. And what I heard from what you're saying is that therapy is a very personal thing, and you got to decide when you're ready, when you're not, what you want to do. Obviously, I will be honest, I advocate for therapy for everyone. Not every week, obviously, for everyone, but I have people who come in every 3 months, every 6 months, just to what they call their oil change. And I just
Mm-hmm.
want to always mention that therapy can always be beneficial. But I
Mm-hmm.
get where you're coming from, because when I started, that's exactly how I felt. Well, I'm a therapist. Why would I have to go to therapy? And now I don't know how I would kind of survive without my therapist. Not every week, obviously, but if I needed him every week, he's there for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therapy is very personal. And what I mean by that too is that when you think about how we grew up and how we do things, we talk about the family dynamics that you talked about, and how it affects us as to what we decide to do for work. And I wonder if that had any influence in your life, because that's a good way to start thinking about that whole therapy and where you got to where you got today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I became a therapist because my mother was she died last October. And that's a whole nother reason I should probably go to therapy. Um, she was a trauma survivor. And what I know now, what we didn't understand as well 30, 40 years ago, was that she really had a lot of trauma that was never dealt with. And when you talk about that, attachment and, reactive attachment, even like, I mean, growing up with a alcoholic father. And, so the story is my grandmother had my mother and her two sisters at 16, 17, and 18. And this was back in the 40s, the 1947, for the late 40s.
Right.
Um, and my grandmother had no choice but to quit school, get married, and her husband worked night jobs. They played hard, drank hard, and fought hard. And they beat the shit out of each other in front of their three kids all the time. And they were poor. They were very poor. And my mother's extended family, her grandmother did her best to mitigate some of this and support her, but it was also a lot of taboo and a lot of hush hush. And and my grandmother was basically the black sheep of the family, from what I understood. And my grandmother was a tragic person who she drank and smoked herself to death, and she ended up having a stroke at 49 years old, but she lived for 15 years. So all in there, like I could just do 10 years of therapy around that. I mean, that was the traumatic part of our lives. And my mother's surviving that, and her role as the caretaker for my grandmother. So as my mother, got older, and whatever relationship issues she had, whatever stress she had, it all trickled down to me being the caretaking. I was always the parentified child.
Okay.
Um, so yes, I became a therapist because that's what I was raised to be. Not
Well,
intentionally, but that's what I became. I was the caretaker.
and besides being the caretaker, I mean, you got to have some sort of passion in helping people besides that. And does that kind of like influence a little bit of what you've had? You said you had, you talked about talking to friends and all that in the past,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
did that influence things or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the spirituality piece, I've never fully become a Buddhist, but I've always followed along with Buddhist philosophy. My parents were both really eclectic in their learning. They were always learning about different religions, and so the idea of compassion for others, compassion for all. I think that is kind of the core of me is I I like people. I enjoy people. I want people to feel, you know, cared for.
Right.
I think that is an innate thing in me that was probably part of my personality. I was a charming child.
Right. I mean, there's so many things I could say about that because, we talk about generational trauma being passed on,
Mhm.
and there's something to be said about what you've talked about playing a factor. You talked about Buddhism, and, as someone who practices Buddhism, I remember that if you're practicing Buddhism, there's no such thing as a Buddhist. There's just
Mm.
practicing Buddhism because they're principles. So,
Mhm.
hate to break it to you, but you're
Mhm.
probably practicing Buddhism
Right.
anyway.
I practice a lot of things.
Right. And
So,
and that
and
uh,
I don't necessarily call them all one thing, but yeah, that's the whole concept.
and my view of religion and spirituality is that, if Muhammad and Abraham and Jesus and Buddha all came together today in 2023, they probably all hang out together and chat and
Mm.
talk about ideas and differences in ideas versus fighting about it. So for
Mm.
me, spirituality at the basis is really something that we can unite upon, no matter what your inclination is. So I'm a big fan of the same type of spirituality you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. I also identify as I don't want to say, and again, I have a hard time identifying. It's, that's the nice thing about Unitarian Universalism is you're whatever you come in the door with, and it's not always definable. But I also identify as a pagan or Wiccan. And again, that's, really the sanctity of life, of all life and nature, that, we're all connected, and we're all worthy, all things, all life is sacred. Yeah, I bring a lot of that into my, my way of being and my philosophy and the way I approach the work I do. And I believe I consider this a calling. It was a calling for me, you know. And I don't think there was anything else besides becoming a dancer. I've listened to some of the podcasts like with Courtney, and I'm like, oh, I could have been that too. I really would have, you know, Broadway or some kind of movement or dance therapist. But the spirituality kind of won out in the end.
Maybe you can, up one up Dr. Ruth and start doing that too. I was thinking about what you just said, and we talked about a lot of spirituality and where being a universalist, Unitarian, really helps. And one of the things that I always find interesting in our lives is to talk about mindfulness. I think that if we don't have mindfulness in our lives, whether we're being cautious about what we're talking about now, because it's easy for me to be distracted, and by being mindful and paying attention to you, I think that this is day-to-day stuff. I think mindfulness sometimes gets this type of moment, but I don't think it's singularly that. But I'd like you to tell me more about mindfulness because I think that's an interesting topic that you've enjoyed talking about in the past.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So, I again go back to my parents. For all of the dysfunction that happened growing up, there was also a lot of very positive and meaningful influence in my life. My father was practicing transcendental meditation right around the time that they were fighting both in therapy and getting divorced. And I remember him like laying down on the couch, and I'm like, I think you're just taking a nap. And he's like, no, I'm actually meditating. And so I learned about transcendental meditation. When I went to grad school, I I did the spirituality and counseling track, and we did a year-long course where we had to practice all of these strategies. So I learned about mindfulness there. I also, again, it goes back to this. Um, what was the course I took? My writing course junior at UMass, my undergraduate, was about consciousness and religion. And we read all of like the Bhagavad Gita and Thomas Merton, New Seeds of Contemplation, like all of that great stuff. And my father, again, at the same time, he was really into Carlos Castaneda, and he was like, we have a really nice pastel drawing of Amanita Muscaria, like all of that, like spiritualism and all the way into like kind of the spiritual drug use world and things like that. So all of that kind of influenced me. And then when I hit grad school and they're like, you have to practice this, you have to chant, you have to shuffle around the room. And I was like, oh, this is so hokey. This is like singing in church. It's so awkward. Um, but I did it. And I'm like, And I felt it, whatever it was. I was like, there's something here and I need to follow this. So a few years later, I ended up signing up for the mindfulness-based stress reduction course at the Center for Mindfulness out of UMass. And that changed my life. I knew that mindfulness practice was, again, something that was part of my journey and part of who I am. And it's something I don't think anybody's perfect at it. There's, I don't follow any gurus. I don't even follow anybody online about it.
Besides me, of course, right?
Of course, right.
Yeah.
You are my guru, Steve. Absolutely. But I learned what it could do. And I did the mindfulness-based stress reduction at a critical point where I was really like shifting, my kids are kind of growing up, and I was, doing more intense work at the clinic, and it created a space. Mindfulness for me creates that space for my own self, my own, peace. And it also created a space for the work that I do, because I needed to be able to compartmentalize so that I could, be there for my kids and be there for my marriage and be there for my family, and also, not crash and burn from my job. So, doing the mindfulness-based stuff really changed the way I cope with life. And I was, the pivotal moment was when at the end of the 8 weeks, you do an all-day meditation, a group meditation, and 200 people show up for these things. Now they do them online, but they've been doing it for 25 plus years. 200 people show up, and they were all the new graduates and all the people from the past. And people go up at the end and they kind of give testimonials. And I thought it was fascinating to hear people say, I did this 25 years ago and I promptly forgot about it. Never sat and meditated again. And then 10 years ago, something happened and it came back to me. It's always there. And then their practice blossomed. So that's I've been kind of weaving in and out. There are times when I do it more. There are times when I'm like, oh, I don't have time for that, but it's like exercise. You need to do it anyways. So mindfulness for me is just every day waking up, taking that moment to breathe and know where you are. That common thing that people talk about, and it's mental health is waking up knowing who you are and what you are meant to do. But I think mindfulness is also that, waking up and being present and being aware of where you are and what you need to do next, or do nothing, right? So a lot of it is mindful eating, mindful walking. And I think it creates, again, that space that allows a certain amount of flow that I don't have to think about things so hard like anymore. They just kind of come out. And maybe I say stupid things once in a while, but I feel like I have more of a focus and more of a flow. And I think mindfulness has created that to some degree.
And I agree. And I think that mindfulness is something that we can all practice. And you can do a mindful walk through a common and take 3 hours to do it, or you can do it for 3 minutes and walk faster afterwards, and it's still mindfulness. And I think that, one of the things I like to demystify with a whole lot of people is mindfulness is not sitting in a quiet retreat for 3 weekends. It's what you make of it. And then, you never forget about it, because mindfulness sometimes is something I need to do when I park my car after maybe some issues while I'm driving or what have you, and learning to use that regularly. And I think that when you talk about singing and chanting, I think I've always said to myself, and this is a conversation I had with one of my clients, until I decided that the singing and the chanting was for me, it was a chore. When I decided it was for me, then, hey, it was fine. So that's when I heard you say about singing and chanting, not pointing fingers at any particular church, but having to sing certain things. I'd be like, I don't believe that. I'm not singing that. And being able to say, no, this means something to me, and I sing it. I think that that's very, very important to distinguish in the spiritual life anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I've also been practicing yoga for 30 years or so. And again, it's one of those things where, you gotta remember to go to the class, or you have to do it yourself. And I finally pulled out my yoga mat, and now it's like in the middle of the dining room. So I'll remember to do it at home. But when I first learned about Om, chanting Om, that was powerful. But it was after I had already learned so much other stuff. And I was like, oh, now I know what this is.
So what if I told you that maybe some people in my audience don't know what Om means? Can
Right.
you explain it a little bit?
Yeah, as best I can. It's
Om,
om. It's a three-syllable
Om.
sound that comes from, I believe, Sanskrit. But what I was taught was it is the sound that the universe makes. And at the end of your, practice, like other chants, there's all kinds of different ways of making sound and in experiencing that audible vibrational you know tone that comes from you and expresses itself outward. So you chant om, and it has a resonance that you feel very deeply. And the idea, when somebody said to me, it's the sound that the universe makes, I was like, oh, absolutely perfect. That did it for me. So yeah, it's commonly practiced in yoga. So
And I think
um,
it's practice in religion too. And
mhm,
I particularly what I've used, and I think your explanation was wonderful. Um, I also talk about it as those three sounds are calming for most people. They're not hard. And being able to go, and just doing that regularly, you almost feel quieter, even if you do
mhm.
it like twice. Um, so I like your explanation now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, any practice, and this is something that we transition to some of the work that I do. Any practice that gets you back in your body, that gets you grounded, is helpful
Mhm.
and necessary.
And I think that's a great transition, as you said, because when we think about sex, and
Mhm.
for me personally, I think that people sometimes get into sex and they don't even feel their own body during sex. I don't want to be the expert here. Obviously, that's you.
Mhm.
Um, can you tell me more about how like people need to, like maybe perhaps what can help them feel more and be more present in their even their sex lives?
Mm. Sex is so complicated. Um, Sex is such an important part of our humanness, of our primateness, of our social structure, of our spiritual experience, our bodily experience, and culturally. I'm going to touch upon that intersectionality a little bit. All these things intersect to create this idea of what sex is, what it's supposed to be, what our bodies say it is for us, and then what our parents say, what our friends say, what the porn industry says, what the the anti-porn industry says, like all of these messages. And we have such limit, I find, from people I've spoken to, and my understanding of the experience, probably from my own personal experiences in some degree. We have these notions about what sex is for us, and it's like this little narrow vision. So often we are detached from our body, from our physical experience, because we're rushing from this and rushing from that. We're rushing through sex, we're rushing through relationships. It takes so much effort and so much energy to be able to feel comfort. And we're taking all the baggage from the way we were raised and all this information, maybe trauma, sexual trauma, all kinds of things that happen to us that really create this rigid space.
Right.
And there's just so much taboo around it, and so much disconnection. And I don't know if it's just our culture or lots of cultures, so much disconnection from our bodies, that sex is problematic for a lot of people.
100%. I think that there's a couple of things that, I think culturally, again, my limitation is two countries, but, you know, I I don't remember a time where it was too taboo to talk to my friends about sex. Maybe with my parents it was, but not necessarily with my friends and stuff like that. in American culture, I think that even as a therapist, sex is part of treatment. And I'm not an expert by any stretch, but I do talk about sex with my clients because I think it's important. And I can even see my clients struggle to talk to me about it. Like I've just like I'm like, did something wrong. And I'm like, why is sex so wrong in your mind? So what I really thought that was important is you talked about we have a problem in our culture about what sex is. If I asked you, forget about society for a second, what is sex?
Sex is the embodiment of, and I'm hoping I'm getting this right, but this is how I understand it. The embodiment of our experience of energy in connection, in pleasure, in joy. Sex is something that comes from within us, right? It's in our brains, it's in our bodies, it's in our sensory system, our experience of the external in the internal world and the interpersonal. So sex is what we do for pleasure.
Mhm.
And I guess some people would argue that it's also for procreation. But I'm not, that's kind of like becomes a bodily function because sex is so much more than procreation.
I
And
agree.
I don't believe that, maybe there's some conservative fundamentalist values that say that we have sex just so that we can have babies. I don't believe that. I believe that sex is actually, an innate drive and energy that we are all, and it doesn't mean one thing or only these two things. It is a individual experience.
Individual experience.
Mm.
I think that I go back to what you said in regards to sex, and being taboo and only for procreation. Again, I'm going to make an overgeneral statement here, and I get it.
Mhm.
I don't know many 50-year-old women that are still quote fertile. And that does that mean that they can't have sex? I know men who get vasectomies. That means they're not procreating, so they should not have sex. I think it's just absolutely absurd to take those things.
Mm.
Do you think it's an influence from you talk about religion? Is there other sociological aspects that are really pushing this taboo of sex?
I mean, it's so insidious. It comes from the puritanical and the religion and um really okay, I'm going to say the patriarchy.
The
um
power.
yeah, the patriarchy also has fashioned a world of, and again that comes from a religious foundation too, that women are really kind of just here for men, and our bodies and our pleasure are only reserved for certain kinds of relationships, and that once and we all know it's not true, right? We all know that when you get older you don't stop wanting sex, but there are lots of women I encounter that they're like, well, I never liked it to begin with, and I'm glad that it's over. I'm glad that I don't have to, like, I have a good reason why. Oh, because it hurts or what. So there's something insidious in us that we don't seem to like sex all that much the way we have it, and it's easy to say, well, if I have it once a month or once a year, that's okay.
Right.
Um, because I think that our definition of sex is pretty narrow too.
Okay. Can before we go on there, because I want to have what do you mean by that? But I also think that for me, working in this field long enough, when I talk to women in their late 30s, early 40s, and they're like, I've never had an orgasm. And I'm like,
Mm,
you're kidding, right? Like
mm,
you never masturbated or used a toy or even get it off with some like whatever. And they look at me like I just said to do sinful things.
mhm.
So I just wanted to put that in there.
Yeah.
But how do we de-narrow the definition of sex? I don't even know if that's a word, but hey, I'm French, so whatever.
So I one thing that I've learned, and that's the great thing about having done the training with ASECT, American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, under which I am certified. And also, I have a certificate in holistic sex therapy from the Institute for Sex Education and Enlightenment. And that was an 18 to 24-month program that I did. Everything that I've learned kind of, expanded my understanding to be so inclusive, because you know what? It's not about the orgasms. It shouldn't have to be about the orgasms. And if you are curious about and seeking and wanting to figure out what your body needs, is what pleasure, and an orgasm is something that you really would like to figure out, does my body do that? Then that's important, But there are people out there that are like, I don't need to have an orgasm. Orgasms don't mean anything to me. It sounds like too much trouble. That's okay too.
Right.
Right. I know I used to believe and this is a problem when I was, with with my peers when I was younger, we all had our kids and we'd talk about sex, and I'd say something like, oh, an orgasm, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, what? Oh no. And they would just be really like uncomfortable with it. And I realized at some point I didn't want to shame anybody that wasn't having the same kind of orgasms that I was having, because everybody's different. Not everybody has them. Right. And we know, conventionally now, I think hopefully everybody realizes that vaginal orgasms are also not the standard.
No.
And, for a long time, people believe that. And so I think we've kind of gotten past that. It's like, okay, clitoral orgasms are the thing, and that's okay. And if we can find that, but there's other places that I can have orgasms, right? There's other things. So I think a lot of it is education and expanding our definition, because I think it's individual. What gives us pleasure? I mean, it might just be, I really like my toes rubbed.
Right.
And that's okay. So we don't judge people's idea of pleasure, but if they feel as though they need to learn more, that's one of the things I'm here for.
So, obviously the education is needed for that. So, when you talk about sex therapy, why is that so important for couples to have? I mean, why would I need sex therapy? I know how to get off. What the hell's the problem?
Well, and that's the thing, is not everybody thinks that they have a need for sexual conversations. Not everybody does. Some people have great sex, or they're happy with whatever sex they have. And that's fine. So it starts with the couple. Like, now that my tag is out there that I'm a sex therapist, I'm getting more calls just for that purpose. But even with that, when somebody comes in as a couple, they're like, well, I need to figure out my sex life. We need to fix this. We're not doing this. We're not having enough sex. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. What else is going on? Because if things aren't going good in the bedroom, then there might be some other things that are going on in your waking hours or whatever. And then the other happens too, is couples come in and they're like, I just need better this, and he needs to do this. And then, you talk a little bit and you're like, well, how's your sex life? What? It's awful. Okay. So is that something that you are interested in working on? Because sometimes, and I think it's Esther Perel has posed this. I'm not sure. Don't quote me necessarily on it, but sometimes,
no one's listening. Don't worry.
Yeah, nobody. Sometimes, working on the intimacy, and not just sex, but intimacy and affection and touch and quality time. That in and of itself can start to soften up some of the other stuff that's going on. So sometimes addressing our sexual needs and our intimacy needs can help feel better about the relationship needs. What I really need is to feel connected to you. And when we finally got to have sex, I feel so much better about you, because this is kind of this pent up energy and this need that just to be close and to be physical. And perhaps I needed to have an orgasm, and I needed that release and that connection. And now I'm not walking around feeling so angry at you. Now maybe I can talk to you. So sometimes that's the process. And some couples are having an awful, awful, awful time with each other and having great sex. So there is no There is no one way. And it's kind of it unfolds as people come in, and I'm the one that asks,
Wait a
how's your
minute.
sex life?
You mean it's just not heterosexual sex?
Oh,
Wow, that's just,
mm,
surprising. I'm
mhm,
joking for those who can't see the video, and I'm being sarcastic here.
mhm,
But the one thing that I really liked is you talked about intimacy, which I think is so key to any type of relationship. You don't have to be in a sexual or loving relationship in that way to have intimacy.
mhm.
How do you define intimacy?
Intimacy is feeling close. It's feeling connected. It's feeling, seen and heard. Um, from I would even say, before birth. I mean, we are intimately connected to our mother and the womb. And, it's that warmth, that heartbeat, that sensation, that flood of chemicals, the
Right.
oxytocin, right? That we need as human primates, we need that to develop our sense of safety, our sense of, where it's that and I'm always taking new trainings and learning new things, and it's fascinating. I love the interpersonal neurobiology, and just did a whole training on the vagals polyvagal system. Right, we need to know what's okay, and intimate connection, whether it's through touch or seeing somebody or knowing the facial expressions or feeling the warmth, feeling the pressure, all of that works on our nervous system. And
Right.
that's what helps us feel safe. So being able to hug, being able to, you know, um, even facial expressions. I understand what you're feeling and thinking, and I feel safe and I feel connected to you because I can see that your face is open and receptive and makes me feel okay with myself. So intimacy is all of that you take care of yourself.
I'm hiding behind the mic now.
You take care of yourself and you feel cared for by others. And it can take the shape of, we sit on the couch and we hold hands. We pat each other on the back. um, we we can laugh together. Intimacy is a lot of things.
And I think that you brought up two things that I'd like you, if you can, to describe, because I got to the audience, because I need to assume that people may not know these words. So you mentioned oxytocin
Mhm.
first. So how can you define oxytocin? What does that mean?
That's the they call it the love hormone, and it's also the thing when I first learned about oxytocin when I was breastfeeding my kids. Oxytocin is that thing that the hormone that releases when you start breastfeeding, and you go, ah,
Hmm.
and you feel really good and you feel really connected. Many people, not, I'm sure other people have different experiences, but that's the purpose of that hormone. And there's other approaches to some couples work, some somatic experiences, and couples work is a 6-second kiss releases oxytocin. A hug releases oxytocin. So it's that hormone that is necessary for us to feel safe, to feel like it's okay to not be worried about things. We're okay right now.
I just want to make sure, because I don't want people to just associate oxytocin to sex.
Right. No.
Or there's a lot of oxytocin that come from that. The other thing that I'm learning about this, but I don't know a whole lot about it. But you call about the polyvagal system and
Mhm.
the vagal nerves. Can you explain a little bit about that? Because that's something that's fairly new to me, so I'm still learning.
It's fascinating, and it's really, when I took the training recently, and I need to do more on it because it's really just an expansive system. And it's about interpersonal neurobiology and understanding how the messages from the environment, from our interactions with people, are constantly giving us feedback in our brains and our bodies. So the polyvagal, the vagus nerve is, and I think the polyvagal just refers to that it's all over your body, multiple branches. So it's a cranial nerve that goes all through your body, along the back, the limbs, and through your digestive area. All of the major organs have connection to the vagal nerves, and It's part of uh, the um, the nervous system is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And what we've learned about it is the sympathetic nervous system is the one that says, "Oh, hurry up, danger, watch out." Stress response. I need to breathe heavier. I need to be more alert. My hearing, my senses are on alert for danger, and then that's where we get our stress response as well. Right.
Right.
And there are lots of things that might signal danger to you that might not signal danger to me because of your experience. Right. So people who are trauma, high alert, hypervigilant are going to be more sensitive to that stuff. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the one that, oh, wait a minute, it's okay. I can calm down now. So that's the de-stressing response, and that's where we learn to breathe and we regulate. Let our heart rate come down. Um, and chemical changes in our brain that help us relax after the danger is past. So that's what I understand about the polyvagal, and it's got a primitive part of the brain, like some of those nerves are older in the brain system, the nervous system, and some of them are more newly developed, and they look at other species that have those same patterns of nerves. um, and the back nerves are more primitive, and they're the more of the protective response. And the front nerves are the ones that are more likely to receive the facial
Right.
communication, body language, and depending on how you're experiencing the getting an upset stomach, getting nervous stomach, getting diarrhea, irritable bowel. That's part of the vagal nervous system that is responding to stress.
Yeah,
That,
I think that the extreme of the polyvagal system is when you have a panic attack.
Mhm.
I think that that's a lot of it. And the other thing that I want to share with everyone is that one of the easiest way to touch your vagal system is to go within inside of your ear. Don't pull like you want to tear your ear off, but you can actually calm yourself by putting your finger in your ear
Mhm.
here. And it's one of the most reachable vagal system. So just wanted to throw that
No,
out. Not that I
no,
know everything, but
yeah, no, that's a good one.
I think that what one of the things that I also, thought about is, we talk about sex. I think that the other part when you talk about some people struggling is consent.
Mhm.
And I think that consent comes up in different places, but I think particularly with sex is very important. How do you describe consent to people so they can understand a little more about it?
Um, consent has become hopefully more integrated into sex education when you can get it, right? Consent in relationships is really about communication. And it's about knowing yourself, thinking, what do I want? What do I need? What I don't want? What do I really, really want to stay away from? Knowing yourself, being prepared, and knowing when you come into that opportunity to be in relationship with somebody that you're having a conversation about what's okay, what's not okay.
Mm.
And what do I know about me? And now what do I want to know about you? And what do we know about each other? Um, Even in, long-term relationships, marriages, I think consent falls away. Like it's because becomes assumption. Well, I
Yes.
thought you just always liked it like that. And when I go like this, you always go like that. So I assume that that's what we wanted to do. Right. And, and that's a whole nother realm. Like, again, we stop talking about sex. We stop thinking about what our bodies really want. And we just kind of give in to these patterns. And then after a while, we're like, yeah, that kind of sucks. So I don't really want to do it anymore. Because we're not even remembering that, you know, it's it's still important to be like, do you like it when I do that? You
Right.
know, I'd like to do this. So I'm gonna reference the wheel of consent. And I need to do more training on this, but I love this. This is Betty Martin, and please look up her website.
I'll attach it to the show notes.
Yeah, Betty Martin. She's finally got a web page, and she's got some great YouTube videos. And it's about there's one that I really like, and I've suggested it to couples, and I need to work with them more on, like, did you do it? How did it go? Because we're doing all of this stuff, a lot of it on Zoom, and folks, I don't know what they're doing when they go home, and half the time they don't do their homework. But Betty Martin has this whole thing called the 3 minute game. And it's practicing consent, really. And then there's the wheel of consent, and it's about giving and receiving, and to be the giver and to be the receiver. And then there's all these other things I'd have to have it in front of me to remember it, but it's complex,
Mhm.
right? It's a complex dynamic of interpersonal, again, knowing yourself, knowing what you're asking for, and knowing what your partner's asking for, and how do you feel about that.
Right.
um so consent is definitely, it's not like, oh, is it okay, but I think people need to be aware that we need to talk. We don't just do it.
Right.
We need to talk about it, and it's hard to talk about. But
And
as somebody once said, if you can't talk about it, you shouldn't be doing it.
right.
Which,
I
is
practice people on consent in outside of sex and consenting to activities, consenting to people coming over and stuff like that. Talking about the importance of consent there so that it can eventually get into their personal life, because there's still some people in the religious realm that says, well, I'm married, I'm the possession of that person. They can do whatever they want. That's not consent. That's just wrong. Um,
Mhm.
so I definitely talk to a lot of people with that. The other thing that came to mind for me as we wrap up here, because I realize we've been doing this for about an hour already, um, the word love. For me personally, again, I like to talk about where I grew up.
Mhm.
In French, there's no word for like.
Mhm.
There's only a word for love. And for me, even today, I still like, I love you, Michelle, but I'm not like, when people are like, where I'm coming from. But there's some people like, what do you mean? Like, why is it so hard for people to understand that love does not always equate to intimacy, sexuality, or what have you?
Mhm. I think it's because we live in a still repressive, puritanical, power differential based society. And, love means sex, but it doesn't,
No.
right? And even, even within families, like, what does love mean? Well, oh, and it's conditional, or it's not conditional, or is it this, or, I think people struggle with it. I think just like intimacy, love is a feeling that emanates from within us and something that we get as an energy from others.
Mhm.
And I feel like love is a positivity. Love is an inclusion. Love is an acceptance of, I accept you for who you are, and I bring my whole self to meet you, and off my authenticity, right?
Right.
I mean, we have boundaries, right? We do have some spaces that we need to make sure that, I don't want to talk about this with you because, our relationship is more casual than that. um but at the same time, I'm not judging you for it. I'm allowing you in as much as I can, and you allow me in. And the appreciation and the exchange of that energy, I think, is love.
Right.
um and I grew up, feeling like, ooh, love is a ooh, ooh. And, and physical touch is also kind of a like weird thing, right? Who was it that I hugged? There was a guy that, in one of my social justice groups that I'm part of, and we had a meeting, and he, after the meeting, he came up to me, and he's this big guy, and I'm like, stuck my hand out, and he's like, how about a hug? And I was like, yeah, okay. Because I still have like ingrained in me that, he's a stranger, kind of. I've only met him twice. But I understood why the hug was important. And I understand the feeling of love and connection to other human beings that share my values and my energy that I want to stay connected to. So that's how I interpret it. And, I think, though, it does get mixed up in that taboo that, growing up, you had to, go hug uncle blah blah blah, and you're like, ew, creepy. So
Right.
there's a boundary thing there too, as far as that touch. And I think love gets wrapped up into that, right? I
Right.
only reserve love for the people that I want to be intimate with.
Well, love and hugs and all that to me is all a continuum. I
Mm.
hug my kids differently than I hug you, than I hug my girlfriend. I
Mhm.
love you differently than I love my kids or my girlfriend, or even clients or whatever. I think that for me, when you see it on a continuum, it's a lot different. And I
Yeah,
think that that's what you're saying. And I agree wholeheartedly.
yeah, everything's on a continuum. We tend
Well,
to put everything in boxes and line them up, and that's not the way anything is.
I think that that's because it makes it easier for us. And unfortunately, sometimes when it's something like that, it doesn't need to be easy. It just has to be accepting. So,
Mm.
well, Michelle, I can't tell you enough that thank you. I
Mm.
really appreciate it. So if someone wants to find you and reach out to you, how do they reach out to you?
Psychology Today is my primary mode.
Okay.
And under Michele Lareau-Alves and um, out of the Holliston office. So that's one way they'll find me. But yeah, generally, word of mouth too. I mean, I really appreciate um, connections and collaborations throughout the field. And I like meeting the people that want to meet me, or the people that know me referring somebody to me. So I think that makes for a more positive experience for everybody, because you'll talk to somebody and you're like, I think that they'll be a good fit for you, right? And I like that. But Psychology Today is really the best place right now.
Well, I hope that people go to Psychology Today and find you. Michelle, I've always enjoyed our relationship all those years from social services to today, but I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I hope people really enjoyed because I think we talked about very important subjects.
Yeah.
And I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to be able to be on and share and talk. And all these topics I think are just really great. And I love talking about them. And I love talking to you, Steve. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right. Thank you.